Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is David Willett, professor of art history here at the College of DuPage, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Visiting Artist Series event. Before we get started, I just want to make sure everybody's got their cell phone silenced. So take a minute, make sure your cell phone is silenced. That would be great. Also, just a note about timing, this will be about a 50-minute event, so sort of 40-minute talk from our visiting artist, and then maybe 10 minutes for Q&A afterwards. So please, if at all possible, stay for the entire event. But if you do have to leave early, kind of maybe situate yourself near an exit and do so without disrupting people if you possibly can. The Visiting Artist Series is a collaboration between the Cleve Carney Museum of Art and the Art Architecture, Photography, and Interior Design programs here at COD. And I don't know, I feel like this is my 9th artist I've brought to campus. And it's a pleasure today to introduce artist and scholar Maria Lux. Maria is a research-driven artist whose work explores the complex ways in which non-human animals are used to shape human knowledge. Like the field of animal studies itself, Maria's work draws from a wide range of disciplines, including the natural sciences, history, literature, and film, blending critical inquiry with sentimentality, satire, sarcasm, and sacrilege. Through her multimedia sculptures and installations, Maria invites us to engage with narratives we construct about animals and their place in human culture. Her pieces incorporate elements of storytelling, archival research, and speculative fiction, creating immersive environments that challenge our perceptions and assumptions. At a time when our relationships to non-human animals are mediated by many cultural and political factors, Maria's work explores the unknowability of animals and helps us to scrutinize our connections with them, even across what John Berger called a narrow abyss of non-comprehension. Maria earned her BFA from Iowa State University in 2006 and her MFA from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2012. She has exhibited her work extensively across the United States with solo exhibitions at Antenna Projects in New Orleans, Up For Gallery in Portland, among others. She's a recipient of a Macmillan Foundation Fellowship and has participated in residencies at Stoveworks in Tennessee, Cowhouse Studios, which is a great name for a studio, Cowhouse Studios in Ireland, and the Virginia Center for Creative Arts. Originally from the Midwest, she's now Associate Professor of Art at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. Please help me welcome Maria Lux.
Thanks everyone so much for being here. Thank you, David, for the introduction. I appreciate all your time over this lunch hour period. I hope my talk is more interesting than my title. Titles are hard. So as David said, I'm an artist that makes work about animals. And for our purposes today, it might actually be helpful to flip that around and think about me as an animal studies researcher whose primary mode of argumentation is art. I think a lot about what artistic research looks like and how it functions. I'm sure part of this is influenced by the places that I did my studies. Both of those universities are research-focused institutions, so they kind of frame everything as a kind of knowledge generation. But I also think maybe part of the reason that I gravitated towards those spaces is because thinking about art as a way of knowing things is something that really comes natural to me. I've always used art as a way to understand stuff around me, to process things, and then to try to communicate some of my ideas to other people. I like participating in other forms of knowledge generation. I like writing. I like participating in discussions. Those are ways to discover knowledge as well. But my primary tools of argumentation are artistic tools. So something that I love about those artistic tools is that there's often a lot of freedom. I still have a commitment to representing my source material truthfully, but being an artist means being able to share that material using a lot of different strategies. Some of those David already mentioned, things like humor or speculation and fiction and storytelling. Being able to talk about the outlier or the weird one instead of the average and like the statistical norms. Insincerity, things that are illogical or maybe like associative, things that are unresolved, and also approaching knowledge as something that's nonlinear. So I typically make works that are in installation format where you might access the information in that installation from a variety of different spots, and so it doesn't necessarily follow in a linear way. Of course, today I'm going to try to talk about these works in a linear fashion, so hopefully that goes okay. So for me, an artistic approach also allows for a really wide variety of materials, and I choose my materials based on what they can add to my argument or my idea, rather than having a particular expertise in any one material. And in fact, oftentimes I don't know what I'm doing at all. When I start a project, like, I don't know how I'm going to carve a giant pig out of foam. I'm going to figure it out. Or how to make a stop motion animation, or edit a video, or use a CNC router to carve an arcade. So again, the materials support the idea behind the work. So what I'd like to do for you today is to talk you through 3 different projects that highlight ways in which I see my work as engaging with research, and how I can take information from other disciplines and make it material or physical. And then how can I contribute to critical discourses, enhance our understanding of this other kinds of research, or even make new arguments or critiques through art making. And then finally, how does that art making re-enter those bigger conversations? I think it's safe to say that most artists engage in research of some kind. It's just how we think about it and talk about it that is different. So oftentimes the first thing that comes to mind when people think about artistic research is material research. It's learning how to manipulate the stuff that you work with. It's color tests. It's trying to make this papier-mâché thylacine head look like the photograph that I'm looking at, right? It's testing out all those different kinds of fur. It's visiting places to understand something in a physical way so I can translate that into the studio. So I think every artist is engaging in some of that material research. For other artists, artistic research means how their work is contextualized with other artists. So they're thinking a lot about, what are my colleagues in sculpture thinking about right now? What are people who are making drawings thinking about right now, and being in that kind of a dialogue? And I have some book covers here of books that analyze other contemporary artists and some historical artists as well who have worked with animals as a subject. These are really great texts for me in trying to figure out where I fit into a bigger conversation within the art world about animals. So if you haven't checked out any of these books and you're interested in animals and art, these are great texts. And then for other artists, research goes beyond topics that are contained within the field of art to topics from other disciplines, and that's where I situate my work. Here you can see just a small example of some of the texts that I've found to be really useful in previous projects. A couple of them are going to pop up in the examples that I show you a little later on. And sometimes I actually physically include the books in my installations, so that top row is like, I actually had those books on the wall amid the artworks as a way of citing work. So one challenge, if you use a lot of research in art making, is that citation practices are really weird and loose and difficult to figure out in art making. So how do I tell people where some of these ideas came from, or give credit for where the research comes from? I have a variety of ways that I do that, but one of them is physically putting books in the space. Okay, so I'm going to start with a relatively straightforward piece, since it'll, I don't know, give you one kind of short example of how I might incorporate research. It's an outlier within my practice as a whole because it's just one thing. And like I said, most of my pieces are multi-part installations that have a lot of complicated parts and take a while to explain, as you'll see. But this one is just one object, and it's a direct response to Carol J. Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat. Has anybody read that book? A couple of people. Okay, so in that book, Adams makes an argument about the relationship between meat eating, patriarchy, and power, and she does that through looking at a lot of different cultures, through history. And so this project was really a very simple engagement with research. It was reading her book and then how can I extend her argument from 1990 when she wrote it to some articles and ideas that had come out more recently when I was thinking about this project. So there was an article from Men's Health magazine in 2004 that basically encouraged American men to eat more meat as a matter of national identity. And it actually made a lot of comparisons in its language choice and its arguments with the UK, with British history. And if you've read Adam's book, you'll know that she does a lot of comparison. A lot of her arguments come from British history. She talks about Henry VIII a lot as a really interesting figure. So it was really uncanny to me that this argument was using some of the same kinds of things that she was talking about. And then, so I had an essay that went along with this piece. So I had some description and quotes from that article. And then I had a couple of other snippets. One was from a conversation with a colleague who just made the statement to me one day, I don't think we'll ever have a vegetarian president. And then another was a transcript from like a political talk show from 2012, where the hosts were talking about, when do you think we're going to have a woman president? And the guest said 2040, 2050. And the other person said, you really think that long, it's going to be that long? And the respondent said, I hope so. So this, like, all these different pieces overlapping about American power structures and meat eating, and thinking about the way that power was conferred through a monarchy, through bloodlines, and then how there's like an effort to not do that in the United States, but that there's maybe still this kind of bloodline thing going on with meat. So what I ended up doing was I took a Burger King crown, if you recognize that, like the icon of American fast food, and styled it after the British crown jewels. And you can see here little cow heads and a cow torso that's cut up, and then an American flag. Okay, so that's one piece, relatively straightforward. Now we're going to go into one that's a little more complicated. This piece is called Magnify, and it is installed in a storefront window. It utilizes that storefront window format to think about natural history museums and reference those. So there's the life-size habitat display on one side, and then miniature diorama in that little blue box there on the other side. So on the right is a dining room of an amateur scientist tableau. That's what that little part is about. And then on the left, inside of that box, is a miniature scene showing Anton van Leeuwenhoek, the non-scientist inventor of sorts of the microscope. So I'm going to go back to why those things are the way they are a little later. But I want to talk about what the work ended up being about. So this work is about the distance between amateur science and professionals, about scientific literacy, and the democratizing and or limiting potential of technology in either reinscribing that line between the amateur and the professional, or crossing that line between the amateur and the professional. So this is one of those projects where, looking back on it, like, all these little pieces fit together perfectly, and you'd almost think I planned it that way, but I did not. So when I started with this project, all I had was, I was watching this like really cute animation of a water bear or a tardigrade kind of rolling along in some moss. Does anybody recognize this image by any chance? How many people know what a water bear or a tardigrade is? Yes, okay. So it's hard to think of a more popular or well-known microscopic animal. They're really charming. They're really cute. They're super weird, right? They are also impressive because of their apparent indestructibility. So you probably all know this, but for people who don't, they are able to survive in really extreme environments. You can put them in extreme heat or cold, high or low pressure. You can dry them out. You can expose them to X-rays and radiation. They've actually survived 5 mass extinctions. They're really old, and they have super weird DNA. So they're just interesting. And I was watching the TV show Cosmos, and saw this animation and thought, okay, I want to make some work about this because they're just really cool. So as you can imagine, knowing all that information about tardigrades, there's a lot of high-level scientific interest in these animals. Trying to figure out how their cells survive these conditions has a lot of possible applications, right? From prolonged space travel to preserving vaccines so you can transport them without refrigeration. So whatever they're doing, it has something to do with that little shriveled up raisin stage. They like go into that kind of hibernation thing, and that allows them to survive these conditions. But how is an open question. So high-level science, interested in the tardigrades, right? But because tardigrades can and do live in like every environment on Earth, it's actually possible for citizen science, random people, to contribute to our body of knowledge about these animals. So you can go out in your backyard and find them with a microscope and report on new species and kind of general scientific observations. So tardigrades are an animal in which this idea of the amateur and the professional sort of collide and different kinds of approaches come together. So one of the more scholarly texts that I found that really helped me think about this tension between professional science and amateur science was this book by Laura J. Snyder called The Philosophical Breakfast Club. And I actually heard about it on a TED Talk. So a lot of times I'll turn to places where you get those little like 20-minute, easy to digest versions of research to decide if it's something that I really need to read all of or not. And so this one was really intriguing. In her book, she describes some of the key changes in the history of science that have given us the kind of scientific context we're in today. So things like scientific societies becoming less like gentlemen's clubs and more like active sites for research, or a shift from royal or like private funding to a sense of science being a public good. And that helped generate this scientific community we have now, but it also resulted in the distancing of average people being taken seriously as contributors to science, which was more of a thing before we shifted into the way that we are today. And then as technology increased, of course, scientists have become increasingly specialized, and you need lots and lots of education to use very specific tools in order to make contributions in your field. Okay, so let's go back to Cosmos. How many people have seen either the original version of Cosmos or the 2014 reboot of Cosmos? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Yay, okay, a few people. So the original version of Cosmos was on public television in 1980, and it was written and hosted by Carl Sagan, who's a famous astronomer. There is a screenshot from Cosmos in that installation. It's on the TV set in that dining room tableau from Cosmos. And up for about a decade, Cosmos was the most widely watched public television program in American public television history. It was really widely seen and very popular. And how many people are familiar with Carl Sagan at all? I'm just trying to get hey, okay, yeah, so he's super famous, right? So he is a great example of kind of the embodiment of this tension, again, between popular science and professional science. So he was a legitimate scientist, made important contributions to his field, but he was much more well-known as somebody who went on late-night television to talk about science and get people excited about it, right? He wrote dozens of best-selling books about science. And so he also faced criticism from his colleagues who felt maybe he was like a little too interested in the popularity part of science, maybe also for himself, rather than the science itself. So that tension in him as a person was interesting to me. And then, so Cosmos was for people that don't know, it was a personal voyage, that's the subtitle, hosted by Carl Sagan, where he like walks us through the history of the universe. So just like a small topic. It took 13 episodes to do that. And throughout all of these stories, he highlights the problem-solving skills of scientists, the creativity, the curiosity, their imagination, right? So in 2014, they made a reboot of Cosmos, and this one was actually televised on Fox. And it was hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who some controversies with him, but in many ways, he took up kind of the legacy of Carl Sagan and became a public figure of science as well, showing up on late night TV, hosting podcasts, things like that. That is Neil deGrasse Tyson on the other side, if you don't know who that is. So particularly at that time, when I was watching the show, there was a lot of conversations about concerns about scientific literacy and the understanding of all of us in the public about the importance of doing science. So that started to emerge to me as something that I wanted to think more about. And all of these little bits of information along the way were kind of heading in that direction, right? Okay. So the fact that Sagan and deGrasse Tyson are both astronomers and focus on space in their research was an appropriate connection to the tardigrade, because one of the most enduring facts about that animal is that it's the only one to survive the vacuum of space. So they, depending on what optical device you use to look at them, they can look like I don't know, like an inflated pair of khaki pants or like this little roly-poly little worm thing that you saw in that CGI animation. Or a lot like Alan Shepard's spacesuit. So you're seeing there a visual association between an X-ray image of a spacesuit and the tardigrade. And so that's one visual way of trying to make that connection between thinking about tardigrade bodies as how can they help us survive the vacuum of space, right? What can we learn from them in order to change where we're able to go? So visual argument that's really straightforward, right? So the amateur scientist in this installation seems obsessed with this idea, is really interested in using tardigrade biology to come up with technologies for human spaceflight. So if you look closely at that dining room table, there's all kinds of sketches for how the tardigrade could be used to imagine going into space, and there's a big drawing of stars on the wall. And then there are also printed copies of scientific studies just directly on the wall that you can probably barely read if you get close enough. One of the things that you'll see on that wall is a printout of something called a Foldscope. Does anybody know what that is? Okay, a couple of people. So this was something I also heard about at a TED Talk. TED Talk is a perfect place for this kind of scientific knowledge to be kind of disseminated to the public, right? This is a project by Stanford professor Manu Prakash, and it's a paper microscope that costs like 50 cents to make or something like that. And the idea is to get this fundamental scientific technology out into places where it might be difficult to get a heavy microscope. There might not be electricity. There might be cost issues, right? And so it helps students, it helps people in under-resourced areas access this fundamental tool of science. So the more I got into this project, you're probably already noticing some of these trends like I was, the more the role of the microscope seemed really important. It just kept coming up. Like, how is this particular tool of visualization a nexus for thinking about all of these different issues? So that brings us to the left side of the installation, looking in this little diorama box through an aperture that's kind of like a microscope hole, right? And inside, you can see this miniature Anton van Leeuwenhoek in his fabric shop. So I don't know how many people recognize that name. Many of you might have memorized him as the inventor of the microscope. He didn't strictly invent the microscope, but he did refine the lens that was used for a microscope to get a kind of clarity that we did not have before. It's another image so you can see his shop a little better. And because I promised to show you a variety of kinds of research, I just want to show you some of the visual research that I was doing for figuring out what outfit does my little miniature Anton need to wear. Something that I did not research thoroughly enough, though, was the microscope itself. So you see in my image how big that microscope is. And if you look at the painting below, it's like actually really tiny. I don't know how I missed that when I was looking at the images, but I saw a replica of this microscope in a museum like some years later, and it's like way smaller than I had it in the diorama. So oops, it's good to be thorough in your research. Okay, so Van Leeuwenhoek was a cloth merchant, not a scientist, right? It was just a hobby working with lenses. So, but even though he was just a hobbyist, his technology yielded the first scientific bestseller, Robert Hooke's 1665 Micrographia. So this is a book that is lavishly illustrated with, so it's like a really big book, and it has all of these drawings of things that people had never seen before that you could now see through the lens of a microscope. And something that's really cool about that book is that all of the drawings are in a circle, which really reinforces the fact that these are things you have to see through the mediation of the microscope. They're not visible to the naked eye. So you might remember that set of wall labels or didactics that appeared in one of my earlier slides. I reproduced it at the top there. I put all of my found images and illustrations and didactics also in a circle and repeated the circular form a lot throughout the installation to get at the importance of the microscope as a tool. I also included the book Micrographia in the illustration in the installation on the table so viewers could kind of see it through the glass as well. So This piece references natural history museums, right? And those are, in and of themselves, sites of interface between the public and scientific information. It's a way of telling scientific stories through objects and images. So I've always liked those spaces, and you can imagine why. But I also mentioned this installation was in a storefront window, and it was actually in a mall in Urbana, Illinois. I don't know if anybody's been to the Lincoln Square Mall. Oh, yes. Okay. So this is like one of my favorite places in the world. It is one of the weirdest, most lovely spots. Because it's on the National Historic Registry, it was one of the first indoor malls in the country. Lots of things can't change about it. And so it has like a very strange combination of stuff that's not what you think would be in a mall. So when I lived in Urbana-Champaign and was working on this project, there was a Baptist church in one of the storefronts. There was a pay-as-you-can acupuncture place. There was a hip-hop and or country music venue. It changed based on the night of the week. And then on the weekends, it was really like a community space. There'd be people like having capoeira classes in the atrium or doing flute recitals. And so even though you might think of a mall as like a place of commerce, it was really more of a place of community gathering. And so when I was first offered the opportunity to show work in this window, I just thought it was a cool place to put some work, right? I didn't realize that it actually ended up being a perfect spot to think about reaching a public that might not walk into an art museum normally, or even a natural history museum. And then also, perfectly enough, all these kind of things came together, right? Around the same time that I found out I was going to have the opportunity to show work in that store window, I had an opportunity to do a storefront residency at a collaborative design studio that was like kind of just across the street from the mall. So they set up a table in their window that faced outside to the street, and then people could just like come and watch me like I was in a zoo while I was working on all of my projects. And then occasionally we would do openings or like public events where people could come in and ask the artist questions. It was a really fun residency to do. And one evening, we were doing one of those events, and this guy came up to me and was like, hey, if I could get a hold of some water bears, would you want to see them using a scanning electron microscope? And I'm like, what? Yes, I would. So it turns out this guy was a microscopist who worked for the Beckman Institute. It's a state-of-the-art research facility as part of the University of Illinois. They have all kinds of equipment that is definitely not something the public has access to normally, but he was just really generous and offered me the chance to use those tools. So he got us some water bears, and then when they arrived, I got to take pictures like this using this amazing microscope. So sadly, you have to kill the water bears in order to put them on that microscope in order to make those observations. But they did also let me borrow regular optical microscopes. So for the opening, there was the opportunity for visitors to the show to actually observe water bears alive in real life at the opening. So in the end, there's so many parts of this project involve the microscope and how different access to information and tools can change your understanding of the world, can change your sense of imagination about the future. The tools that are needed to do this high-end research are still inaccessible to the public. That's not something random members of the public can use, and they do require a lot of training. But my hope is that this case study of the tardigrade helps us think about where we've been and where we might go in our relationship of the public and private aspects of science. Okay, so that's one piece. I got one more to show you. So this installation is called Eat, Drink, and Be Merry, and it's another example of a project that utilized a lot of different kinds of research, from reading a bunch of text to especially talking with a lot of experts in this case and doing some site visits. So this piece brings together two stories about zoonotic diseases. These are diseases that originate in animals and then they spill over into human populations. And they ended up being connected along the lines of European colonial history. But again, I didn't know that when I started the project. All I knew was that I was interested in these stories. And then as the research unfolds, you start to come to some conclusions. So I'll quickly summarize both of these cases for you in case you're not familiar with them. And then I will talk about how the details of the visualization of these stories kind of follows from the research. So we'll start with this one. One of the stories I was looking at is referred to as the Indian vulture crisis. Show of hands on that one. Anybody heard of that one? Just a couple people. Okay. So there are 3 vulture species that are endemic to India. And in the 90s, people started to notice a really sharp decline in those populations. 97% of those vultures were gone, and they did not know why. So the result of the loss of those vultures was this huge uptake in rabies cases. Because vultures weren't cleaning cattle carcasses, it left a food source for dogs and rats and big cats, mammals that proliferated. And of course, those mammals can carry and die from rabies. Birds don't. And so what ended up happening was this huge spike in human rabies deaths. Rabies is one of those zoonotic diseases, right? Animal into human. Spoiler alert, the reason that the vultures were dying turns out to be a total accident. It was people were giving a pain reliever to cattle out of compassion for the cattle. And if a cow died with that drug in their system and a vulture fed on that cow, vultures die within a couple of days. And so unintentionally, they poisoned this huge population of vultures. Okay, so that's one of the stories that I was looking at. And then the second one is looking at a cluster of outbreaks of Nipah virus in Bangladesh between 2010 and 2014. So Nipah is one of these many viruses that is harbored and amplified in fruit bats, although that was a mystery for a long time. It's like, where are all these viruses hiding? It turns out fruit bats carry a whole lot of them. And this particular spillover event ended up being traced to palm wine. So people tap the palm trees to get sap in order to make wine out of it. And as it turns out, fruit bats also really like sap. And so they, the polite way of saying it is they shed the virus into the sap cups. Their feces, their urine, and their saliva drips down into these cups, right? So basically people were just drinking the virus. But again, it took a long time to figure out that that's where it was coming from. So I read about the vulture crisis story in a book called Vulture by Tom Van Doren. And the Nipah story came from a book called Spillover by a science writer named David Quammen. And one of the things that's really striking about these stories is the way they highlight the relationship of risk and mortality to economic and geographic circumstances. So rabies is 100% fatal no matter where you live, no matter who you are, right? Although your chances of getting bitten by a rabid dog vary a lot by where you live. But Nipah virus, your chances of dying of Nipah virus vary drastically depending on what country you live in. And so, access to healthcare, basic human needs, infrastructure, all of that leads to disparity in health outcomes. Many people have written and studied this, right? Whether it has to do with, climate issues or pollution or all kinds of issues. There's disproportionate ways in which risk is borne by people without the means to distance themselves from that danger. And meanwhile, people who are able to remove themselves often really benefit from, exported products from those places, luxury goods, things that we really want, but don't want to have the risk of living alongside something dangerous. So as I thought about these two sites of contemporary disease outbreak, I realized that both of them were places that were held as colonies by countries that experienced their kind of highest prosperity, what we might call their golden ages, during the time that they were extracting resources from those other places. That makes sense. It's kind of a convoluted way to think through it. So, for example, for the Indian vulture crisis, the Victorian era in England, widely thought of as like a golden age in England, was the time period in which they held India as a colony. And with the Dutch Golden Age in the 17th century, coincided with their colonization of what's now Bangladesh. So these are time periods that I learned about a lot when I was an undergrad and I was studying art history, and thinking about the ways in which all these decorative arts that those countries made during those heydays of prosperity, these really beautiful objects that we admired and analyzed in class, were influenced by or directly taken from these other places in the world. And so that seemed like a really great way to visualize these kinds of arguments, to make a visual connection between those histories and the outbreaks that we're seeing today, and to try to think through the implications of those histories over time. So decorative arts to disease, kind of a convoluted way to get there. So to return to the Vulture project, I'll talk through some of those decisions. This piece has like a tea time setting on this table that's bamboo and gold lacquer style table. And in the middle of the table is my version of a Victoria sponge cake, which has, you can see, cake toppers on it. One is a dead cow flopped over on the side, and then a whole bunch of very interested looking dogs trying to climb up the side of the cake. And then around that cake is a set of teacups from the Royal Standard Tea Company, Royal Standard China Company. Anyway, and the pattern on them is called Indian Summer, which is inspired by Indian decorative arts. And the china is bone china. Does anybody know what bone china is? Hey, oh, cool, okay. Bone china is actually made out of bones. So this was developed in England as a way to use cattle bones from slaughterhouses, take that bone ash and use it in the process of making porcelain, making china. And interestingly enough, up until the point in which the vultures were not around to fully clean the cow bones in India, this was also a source of income for folks who would go clean up the cow bones that are, been picked clean by the vultures, and then take them to either be turned into china or be used in fertilizer making. So a really weird, interesting connection that I didn't know anything about until I started digging deeper into the meaning of these materials. So this is one way in which choosing a material really carefully can be embedded with a lot of meaning and additional information that if the viewer has a chance to have access to that, I hope can really inform the project. So because I was living in Illinois at the time that I was working on this project as well, I ended up having a lot of questions about vultures and fruit bats, and I lived close enough to the Field Museum that I made an appointment with the curators to go behind the scenes and take a look at some of the specimens that they had and ask them questions about their research, which was such an amazing opportunity. I love the excuse that art often gives to talk to people about what they do. So I got to look at these drawers full of different research specimens. That's a photograph I took of one of the species of vultures that has almost gone extinct. And then, as you can see, I used that image to inform this wallpaper pattern that I designed to go on the walls in the installation. This wallpaper references this late Victorian style of wallpaper by Walter Crane that many people might be familiar with. And it's also embedded with lots of little details about the research behind the project. So for example, here you can see that I kind of designed this floral pattern that references the chemical diagram for the drug that they were giving cows. And then there's a little pattern of rabies viruses, symbol of a rabies virus embedded in that design as well. And this was another case where I took an opportunity to talk to an expert because I had a bunch of questions that I was having trouble understanding as a non-scientist. And so I met with a virologist at the University of Illinois to explain rabies to me, so I was really interested in that. For the fruit bat project, I referenced the style of Dutch pottery known as Delftware that gets its inspiration and techniques from Chinese pottery. And you can see on these vases that I put little vignettes that try to tell some of the story of how the virus gets into the palm wine. So here's a person tapping a palm tree. And then here's a fruit bat hanging upside down, drinking palm sap. And these are on a table flanking this kind of precarious stack of goblets with palm wine inside, and then hanging ominously over the top of these goblets of wine is this chandelier. Now, the overall shape of the chandelier is decently like a 17th century Dutch chandelier, but they would not have had crystals like this, but I wanted to add them because they are little fruit bats. And then the tablecloth, this Dutch lace-inspired tablecloth, you can see symbols of other viruses that are embedded in the tablecloth design, is made out of Tyvek. So Tyvek is a moisture barrier material, right? Used to insulate your house. It's also used in hazmat suits. Oftentimes the people you see on TV who are trying to deal with an outbreak of some disease are wearing these kinds of non-permeable suits, right? So that material has a meaning. And so I wanted to design this tablecloth using Tyvek. And this is a great example of material research where sometimes artists want to use something in the way you're not supposed to, and then you have to figure out from scratch and a lot of trial and error how to do that. So I used a laser cutter for this, and if you've ever used a laser cutter, you know that it's really hard to get a lightweight material to hold still in a laser cutter because there's an exhaust fan. And so trying to even get the things to how to mount them in the laser cutter so that this would work and get the level of detail I wanted so it doesn't start on fire, how you fit a giant tablecloth into a laser cutter that it doesn't want to fit into. So a lot of trial and error in that for the material research. I included a painting in this installation that is very clearly a reference to memento mori paintings, which are a really common kind of still life at this time period. I used to do painting all the time, and I hadn't made a painting very long time before this, and that was not like getting back on a bike. That was a big learning curve again to get back into painting. But this is a painting that shows fruits and flowers that are pollinated or dispersed by fruit bats, so things that we would not be able to enjoy if fruit bats didn't exist. And then the frame has these carvings of symbols of all the viruses, many of the viruses, that fruit bats harbor that can make us very sick. So this is another example of a project really benefiting from the expertise of a scholar outside of my field. So at the time, there was a curator at the University of Illinois whose expertise was in 17th century Dutch still life painting. So I was like, I got to go talk to this person and get their advice on how I should construct this painting. And one of the things that came out of our conversation was I had always seen these kinds of paintings in museums with like those big gold ornate frames around them. So that's what I was planning to do. And when I talked to this curator, she was like, no, that's a modern convention to put them in that style of frame. What the frames actually looked like was like this. And she showed me physical examples of these historic frames in our collection in the storage area. And it completely transformed, what I ended up making and a little more effort towards some historical accuracy. For a project like this one, there's a lot of detailed research that's pretty hard to convey through just the objects themselves, right? It's all in there, but it's like kind of hidden and they're like clues. And so for this piece, I actually made a little artist book that has essays in it where I explain all of this and more for the viewers. So if they want to take the time to read that, they can have access to all the information that I've given you today. Otherwise, it's kind of a different viewing experience, right? Okay, so you have seen examples of a lot of different ways in which my work incorporates the research of other people, how that research takes a visual form or becomes physical, and hopefully some of the things that emerge from making those things physical, some of the insights that I wouldn't have thought of before I started making something, that I might not have arrived at if I was writing about it, and the ways that art making can like open up some new ways of thinking. It's just coincidental that 2 out of the 3 pieces that I was showing you today are really heavily science focused. If you look at my other work, you'll see that I'm build off of the research of cultural geographers and anthropologists and studies of scholars of English literature and film and media studies folks and history of science people. So there's like a lot of different things that I'm pulling from. But regardless, I hope that you can see how these things kind of play out. And the approach is really similar with all my projects, regardless of what discipline I'm borrowing work from. But the question remains then, okay, how do I kind of re-enter the conversation, the scholarly conversations that are happening in these disciplines that I have been taking work from? How do you get people to see that? Or how does this work participate in those conversations, right? So for artists, one of the main ways that we publish work is through exhibition, right? We put our stuff in a physical space and we hope that people can come and take a look at it. Of course, that is limited by geography. Not everybody can get there. And it's limited by time. Most shows do not go on forever, right? So there is a challenge in documenting your work and then how to express it in other forms. So for me, it's really important to take my work first in kind of verbal context like this. So getting to do an artist talk is amazing. Going to conferences is another place where I really like to take my work because that's a format where everybody, regardless of their discipline, is putting their work into a similar format of, I'm going to show you images on the screen. I'm going to talk to you about what I do. There are animal studies conferences specifically that are so fun to go to and again have tons of different disciplines. And there's other conferences that just have a lot of disciplines present. So those are the ones that I really prioritize rather than going to a conference that's just about art, right? As you can imagine, I get lots of ideas from those cross-disciplinary spaces. And because they're cross-disciplinary, they're really welcoming to artists to come and share their form of research with them. So that's one way that I try to get this work out into the world differently. The other way is that I try to repackage the artistic research in some of the more traditional scholarly forms, like writing essays, getting it published in books or journals. So all three of the pieces that I showed you today have other lives in written forms along with image documentation. The Monarchy Project was published in a book called The Art of the Animal. And that was a really unique experience because I made the work for that book. 14 artists were invited to respond to Carol J. Adams' work. So I was like given a prompt, which is not a thing. When you're a student, you get prompts all the time and it's amazing. And then afterwards you have to come up with your own prompt and it's really hard. So this was cool to have somebody just be like, here, this is the text you're going to respond to. And so I knew that I was going to be writing an essay to go along with that. That was part of the project. Was it's going to be in a physical show, it's going to be in this book, and every artist has the opportunity to write something to go with it. So that might be one of the reasons why that piece is actually like pretty simple, because I knew it was going to live in a book and I needed it to be easy to photograph and understand in that context. And I knew I had all this space to work out the ideas verbally alongside the image. So that's one place where things published. My Magnify project was in the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture, NTNA. If you are a person that likes art about animals or about nature and you haven't seen this journal, it is like one of the most exciting journals to look at. It's full of beautiful images. All of their issues are available for free online via PDF. And I've followed them and read about so many artists that I feel like, oh, I really want to be in context with these people for a long time. So I'm not gonna lie, it was like really super exciting when they're like, yes, you can have some images and an artist statement in this issue. So that was really cool. And then probably the weirdest or most unexpected place that I've published about my work is in a special issue of Social Work and Mental Health. So this issue of this magazine or journal was about climate injustice, social work, animals, and the environment. And for that piece, I ended up emphasizing a part of that project that I didn't have time to show you today, but that looked at management of death anxiety and the work of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, if that's a name that means anything to anybody else. So that part was expanded upon a little more in that writing. I don't know if that makes any more sense of why my work is in the Journal of Social Work or not, but it is. So those are a few examples of places where the work has landed with the hopes of reaching scholars that might find something interesting in my visual form of an argument, and that we can just continue this conversation onward, building knowledge off of one another. Okay, that's a lot of information. So I think we have, I don't know what time it is, but I'm sure we have time for questions, yes? Okay.
But I do think it's important that if some adults have questions, we take. So does anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Wait, I'm talking. How did you do the tie back on the laser?
So if you, here I can go back to it. I ended up doing it in really small pieces. So if you can see there's stitching around all the edges. So I cut it into panels and I spray fixed it to a piece of cardboard really lightly, cut it out that way and peeled it off. So it was a little sticky on the back, but it ended up being okay.
I see. Question.
That's a great question. I think the researchy part where I'm like reading a bunch of things and I have a terrible memory, so I have to like take tons of notes and like then I translate those notes to this like secret blog that only I have so that I can search all the notes because I won't remember that stuff. So I'll be like building up ideas over like many years that I just don't know where they're going to go yet. But then when it comes time to actually make work, oftentimes because I teach and my teaching responsibilities are really important to me, I end up making all of the physical work in like a really short amount of time. So like I did a recent show that I did everything in like 14 days, 16 days, something like that, which was, I don't recommend. This project right here probably took, I don't know, like maybe a year, 6 months to a year to like do all the different parts.
Yeah. I noticed that you have a ton of different types of art making that you're using in this painting, crafting, pottery, samples. Like, there's so many different things. How do you find what's what? It's like, do you have to learn new things every single time? And how do you decide what things those are going to be so that you're not spending all of your time making, trying to learn something new? And
Yeah. I do think that I like the opportunity to learn the new things. So when there is something that I've never tried before, if I really want that to be the outcome of the project, then it motivates me to want to learn it. Like I did a comic and I'd never drawn a comic before, and that's really hard. But it was a great opportunity to learn something new. So oftentimes I do like, I'm just starting from scratch. Now that I've been making things for a longer period of time, there are things that I return to that I have gotten better at over time, which is nice. It saves you some trouble. And tools that I've used repeatedly. Like I used to work in a 3D fabrication lab, so I had access to the laser cutter and 3D printers. So being comfortable using those tools means I can adapt them really easily to new projects, even if the material is weird and I still have some like trial and error to do.
One more. I throw the tongue to what very of cutting about the concert, the big things he has, but we never talked about the vision, their works, but see what is it? Just of the time rate slaves Abby when had missed and spur.
Yes.
That knows the way it is and should diorama it's up there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one thing that art making really can help contribute to our understanding of those kinds of spaces. There's lots of artists that make work about museums and dioramas. And I think part of what a lot of those artists are doing, and I hope I do sometimes too, is to like remind us that all of our knowledge generation is rooted in biases and limitations of the knowledge we had at the time and particular approaches to storytelling. And so like, to me, even though a lot of those installations in museums, like they need updating. Part of what's interesting is like they also embed things about their past and about the context in which they were made that I also think is interesting to think about too. So one of the tricky things with engaging with scientific research is like being both like trying to bring out the cultural dimensions of scientific research while still recognizing that scientific rigor gives us things that we can trust until we get more information that changes our mind, right? That like the scientific process is a valid process, but also science is made by humans in a cultural context that complicates things. So I think artists are in a nice spot where they can like try to do that with all different kinds of research and think like, how are our ways of making knowledge, what is the significance of those different ways that we make knowledge and share knowledge? Does that make sense?
Probably got to wrap it up and sprint vibe after. So there are a couple more questions. If y'all want to come down, I'll ask where you one-on-one afterwards. And great. But thanks for everybody for your time this morning, and we'll see you next time on some future date, 8 for Andy Chris talk for the next visiting artist. So thanks.
Thanks, everybody.